All right. OBS took a minute to spin up, so thought for a second it was just going to crash or not work at all, but yeah, it seems like we're good. So I am back to kick off another week of Odinmade Hero, where I'm going to keep learning from Casey over here one day at a time how to build a game engine from scratch, and also, the rest of the game too. But primarily the game engine stuff is kind of what I'm well, we have to have an engine, but we also have to have a game that we want to. Casey always talks about this, like build the usage code, write the usage code first, and then, kind of extrapolate the engine out of that. So it's kind of both at the same time. But anyway, hope everybody had a good weekend. I'm excited to keep rolling with this. I was thinking heavily about the format of the stream over the weekend, and I was tempted to change it quite a bit. And then I decided not to do that at all because I was thinking to myself, it's been 5 weeks. I've kind of played with this and it's worked out okay. But then, some other things happened and I thought, well, I'll just keep doing this the way I've been doing it until it becomes obvious to me that I should do things another way. Just really give it a fair shake. But I kind of thought maybe 5 weeks is enough to start changing up the format, and then I decided against that. So maybe I will change the format heavily at some point. But basically what I was thinking is that instead of doing it one day at a time on stream, is that I would actually just work through it off stream, because it does take longer to do it on stream. As beneficial as I'm finding it to learn on stream, it's just a very different way to learn so far. But I thought I would take notes as I go for each day, and then I could kind of come back around on the following week and talk about those notes. But then I decided, against doing things that way. But maybe I will change things up at some point. I just don't know what that is supposed to look like. It's really hard because it's such a weird format, and I'm worried that if I mess with it too much, it might just be more weird and harder to follow. At least when we're doing it this way, you're listening to Casey talk about these things that we talk about, like last week with all that collision detection stuff. I think sticking to that original premise, and that really is in the spirit of what his series was about. He's, sort of fumbling through and learning how he actually wants to architect things as he goes. And that's kind of like the nuance that I think gets lost when you do try and break things down in a more like extrapolated way, like here's all of the high level things, but then you're missing all these details that he goes through while he's learning himself how he wants to do things. So anyway, all of that rambling aside, we're just going to keep going like we have been, and we'll see what happens. We'll see where this road goes, because I still don't totally know myself, as I've pointed out plenty of times before. But last week we were focusing on getting the kind of player movement code, or entity movement code now, I guess, into better shape, and figuring out how to do some basic collision detection just so it doesn't feel really sloppy to move around these rooms that we can never leave, because even though I can technically walk off screen here and navigate through each of these rooms, we never really go anywhere. We're just stuck. But at least it feels good. We're not stuck on the walls, at least. We can kind of nicely grind alongside them and then move in and out of these rooms, always stuck in the mushroom forest, never going anywhere. Again, it just reminds me so much of that PT experience. There's something eerie about that, never being able to actually go anywhere. Anyway, so today it looks like we're going to move away from the collision detection stuff, and we're going to be talking more about just entity movement in general, and splitting out the handling of entities based on how frequently we want to update them. And it's at this point where I think Casey starts talking about some things like, entities going dormant and stuff like that. So there's quite a bit of blackboarding in the first half of today's episode, but then we'll get into some code in the later half. And for once, I have plenty of time to actually sit with this, so I won't feel rushed, but at the same time, I do have some stuff later this afternoon I have to deal with, so I won't take my time. I won't be too leisurely with this, but I can make sure that I'm, retaining everything, and that, we'll arm ourselves with more knowledge, just one more day at a time. So let's kick off day 51, separating entities by update frequency.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Handmade Hero, the only show available on planet Earth, on the whole, perhaps even in the whole universe. We do not know how far these radio waves may be traveling right now across the galaxies. The only place where aliens on Mars, should they exist, can tune in some sense, if they had some magical way of doing so, to the place where an entire game is coded from scratch, using no engines, no libraries. They said that was absolutely crazy, but how crazy really is it at the end of the day? I think we've totally proven that it's possible. It's not only possible, but it actually has some pretty awesome benefits to it. One of them being that we get to kind of muck around in all of the sort of crazy underlying stuff and do cool things like the loop live code editing and that sort of stuff that really, you would never get a chance to play with. It's too much fun. I don't know, that's just me. Maybe everyone else thinks it's crazy, but I still think it's a good idea, and I think the Martians on Mars probably agree with me. When the rover finds them, they're going to be like, I'm so glad somebody finally did a series that wasn't using an engine. That's probably what they're going to say, at least I'm fairly certain. But not everything can be for Martians, so sometimes we got to talk about other stuff, which is stuff you got to think about whether you're doing an engine or anything else. And so that's what we got to do today. Now, I want to quickly take one moment to say that here we are on day 51. If you have pre-ordered the game, you can unzip day 50's source zip. You should have gotten a link in your email, and if you go to that link, you can download both the test assets that we've been using and a zip file that has every day's source code in its own little private zip. Unzip day 50, and you will be where I am today, so that you can follow along at home if that is something that you want to do. And I highly recommend it, because following along at home is the best way to learn, I would say, and tinkering with stuff is certainly a very good way to learn, and so that's a very good way to do that. Anyway, so let's talk about some of those things that the Martians have been waiting for me to talk about. Basically, we are at the point where we sort of implemented a rudimentary collision detector that does some of the things that we need. It can glide along walls and that sort of stuff, and we can move our guy around. But we have, at this point, we kind of have to open up into a new area of development because, like I said, right now what we're doing is we're sort of getting basic pieces, all the basic pieces in place and seeing how they work so that we can go start writing full, like shippable quality engine versions of each one. But until we actually have one of everything in place, I typically don't like to do that. Like I said, I want to explore the code first. I want to know how everything fits together, and then I go start writing sort of the industrial strength version of things. But the problem is now I'm not sure what the next best thing to do would be to do at this point. There's really two separate areas that I want to tackle, and they're sort of independent. One area is animation. Like I said, I really want to animate this guy, right? I want him to hop along when he moves and that sort of stuff. So I want to sort of put in an animation system because that's a big key component that I want to have in there so we can see how it works, so we know what its requirements are and that sort of thing for when we build the final version. But the other thing is multiple entities. Now we have, obviously, I think I still have the controller over here. We have the ability to drop more than one dude in here, right? So we've got another dude, but they don't actually interact in any way, right? So they don't collide, and we really don't have any notion of an entity system or anything like that, right? We've got nothing of that form whatsoever. And so basically what I want to do is say, okay, what exactly are we going to do here in terms of getting multiple entities and that sort of stuff, because that's kind of a big part of the whole shebang. And there's also a sort of thing that came up the other night that I was saying where I really want to get to the point where we don't have to deal with coordinates all the time that are in the sort of tile map center offset format. I really wanted it to mostly be the case that entities got packed away in that format when they were no longer useful from moment to moment, and that most of the time what was happening is that entities were actually all any entities that were involved in the screen that we were on or nearby were always just in float space. So that's like a pretty big thing that I'd like to tackle as well, and I just don't know which of these is the most important to tackle. What I don't want to do is keep going with the collision detector, because I think the collision detector is, it's pretty janky. There's no question about that. But there's not a whole lot more that we need to do to know what it has to do. And so I feel like going any further down the collision detector path, like trying to make it actually be robust and nice and good and all that sort of stuff, and support more different types of objects and those sorts of things, are all stuff that can pretty much be put off till when we actually write the final version. I don't think there's anything that's necessarily going to stop us too much. So that's that. So just thinking that through, really the point that I'm at right now is just trying to figure out what do I really want to start doing now? What is the most useful thing to start doing? And so I'm thinking that probably what it is I think it probably is the sort of multiple entity kind of more like let's get the gamey sort of stuff running. Like an example would be maybe we have a guy and a little monster that attacks the guy, and there's like health, and the health goes down, and the monster can be off screen or walk on screen, these sorts of things. And then monsters that are far away are not getting simulated at the same rate, those sorts of things. Trying to start putting those in seems like maybe the better idea, and the reason for that is because, like I said, I would like to get away from that coordinate system thing where we're sort of constantly using these coordinates that I really kind of only intended for packing. And also, we don't really know exactly how we're storing other stuff like world stuff too. So I don't know, there just seems like there's a lot of stuff that probably wants to get sorted out there, and maybe that's more important than animation right now. And also, animation might, how we do animation might be somewhat informed by that, because if everything is operating in that float space, that may have some implications for how the animation system works, and it may make it easier to develop the animation system if we've already cleaned that cruft out. I don't know. So that's what I'm thinking. That's just off the top of my head. So I think that's probably the best thing to do. So hopefully everyone's at least somewhat on board with that as a concept. And from there, I think I'm just going to go ahead and start playing with that and see where we get with it, right? I think that's probably the most logical thing to do. So we'll just spend a couple days getting that sort of part up and ready, and then we can sort of also have a little bit of a, we kind of see, we walk through the world and there's people in it and that sort of thing, and we can kind of start to see roughly how that's going to work. So let's just say that that's something that we want to do, and let's take stock of where we're at and see what it's going to take to get us to a point where that sort of stuff starts to happen.
I guess I'll point out at this point that I don't really have a concrete idea. I have some themes, and I've hinted at this sort of thing before. I have some themes that I want to play with in whatever such game I decide to make someday. But to make that more concrete and talk about actual mechanics, he's talking about, adding health to the player and adding some monsters that you can do damage to, that sort of thing, which is what we'll start setting ourselves up for. Which actually has us thinking about a game, like game mechanics, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing them, versus like doing animation of the player, which I'm just as excited to learn about how that stuff comes together. But I think adding health to the player and having, mobs that you can do damage to is one thing. Another thing that I'm thinking about and I'm going to be thinking about as we move through the next, however many weeks we spend thinking about these things and working on them in Odinmade and Handmade Hero, right, is this notion of like growing resources in the game world. So think about like Minecraft growing crops or whatever, or Don't Starve, where there's some kind of survival aspect to it. And then also having just creatures in the world that aren't necessarily antagonistic. They're not all mobs, and maybe they just kind of react to things you do, but not necessarily in terms of like if you aggro them, they try and kill you, or if you if they just see you, they're instantly aggroed. So something like that, but I'm not interested in just doing a rote copy of that. I'm not interested in making a Minecraft clone, for instance. Not that that wouldn't be educational, but no, that's weird. My OBS just farted. I wonder if the stream... Well, my chat is definitely broken, I just noticed. Plants vs. Zombies. I don't think I've ever played Plants vs. Zombies or even like seen footage of it. It's a mobile game, right? Yeah, what on earth is that? Okay, well now I see my chat over here in OBS. Well, on my OBS preview, but I don't see it. And actually, it's been broken for a minute. Hold on real quick while I try and bring that back. Maybe I'll get messages now, but that's annoying. Ever since it like logged me out randomly a week ago, it's just been, the chat has not worked. Oh well.
So obviously we've got a tile map system here that's basically just meant to virtualize a giant map where there only exist tiles in some locations, right? That's essentially what we wrote here. And we decided that we didn't want it to wrap because we thought wrapping was probably not a good idea. So we're probably going to get rid of the concept of wrapping for now, although we'll see how that goes. Because it seemed like that was just going to introduce bugs, and there was no real reason to do it because the world was so large no one could really ever walk from one end to the end, from one end to the other. Anyway, that was kind of one of the design ideas behind the fact that it was going to be a sparse tile map, was that there would be no way you could ever make a world, there'd be no way that you'd ever want to make a world larger than what it could support. So if we ever did want the world to appear to be wrapping, what we would do is actually just virtualize, sort of like say when you hit these tiles, you wrap around to another set of tiles or something like this. So given that I have that, I guess that's sort of the idea that I was toying with, and that I sort of think is the way I would like to go with it, is instead of always actually doing computations on these tile map things and having everyone be represented with these tile map positions that are basically, sort of overkill for most of the operations we're doing, because they're only there to allow us to have these huge maps. But in any given section, we could do all of the operations in float, which is what I want, because that's much faster than having to deal with these tile map positions and dealing with the wrapping from one tile to the next, like the sort of moving from tile to tile and renormalizing the offsets and all that stuff. So thinking about that, what I'm sort of in my head envisioning is sort of this concept that what we have is sort of two sets of entities, basically, right? There'd be one set of entities where the entities were actually like active, and they were actually moving around with full floating point precision in the world where we are. And then there'd be sort of like, I don't really want them to necessarily be dormant entities, because I want them to still potentially have behaviors, but they'd be entities who exist pretty much solely in tilemap space and are updated at a much lower frequency. And so what I'm thinking is, like, let's say we build a world, you know, and in Krita I could sort of do a little diagram, a little rough diagram of sort of what I'm thinking about here, which is that...
Before he goes on and off on this new path here, I wanted to actually show something really quick with the whole wrapping problem that he was just alluding to. And this is actually back here. So I think I understand better. Last week I was kind of going on and on about this issue with the idea that the game world wraps and how ultimately it doesn't provide you with any benefit to have it do that. But I wanted to understand why that was more trouble than it's worth, because it's just, you know, something something to learn that I didn't know before. So now that the collision detection is working a bit better, we're not getting stuck inside of walls, you know, because of basically what was it, something was going on where the velocity was not zeroing out after doing the collision detection, and so we were just getting stuck inside of walls. And basically what I can do is just show, what was it? Basically what I was trying to show, I think it was on Friday, where if we go down and wrap, you know, to the end of the world in the Y, now we won't get stuck, and we kind of see actually what the real problem is, and it actually has to do with the collision detection, I'm pretty sure. Because what if we go down in Y and we've wrapped in Y, but we haven't wrapped in X, there's like this confusion basically where the collision detection code thinks there's a wall where there is none, and or at least I think that's what's happening. And so I can kind of illustrate that a little bit here. If we just do the same thing, where we follow the player entity exactly with the camera, so we're not dealing with that wrapping issue with the camera, and we can just see exactly what's going on. Now I can go down here, and I think I can basically go as far as I want, yeah. So there's no problem with us wrapping down in the Y direction if we just say there's nothing there, there's no world here. But then the second we try to go left and right, we find that there is an issue. Right, so I can go up and down in either way. Well, I guess starting up here, right? If I move left and right across the X plane before doing this wrap further down in the Y direction, so we're going further and further down in Y after wrapping that value all the way to that 4 billion number, then we start running into issues with going left to right. And I assume it's the same thing in the X direction here. So now I can go far and further and further up, well, down in the X direction after we've wrapped, right? But I can't go up and down. You see that? So it's more specific. It's not that we can't get those coordinates and then draw the player there wherever he's moving. It's more specifically once we get into colliding with entities that it becomes a real problem. And so that finally cemented it for me, like why that's, like where is the actual issue coming from? Because in my head I was like, I was thinking to myself, this is really just, you know, an issue of like where are we drawing? And it's actually, and it makes sense, right? Because we're in the player movement code and we're talking about colliding with entities, and reconciling that the Y coordinate has wrapped but the X hasn't is and dealing with the collision of with entities is where you have to start thinking about that math a little bit harder, and it just isn't worth the trouble at all, right? So we can put that to bed, I think.
Suppose that this, sort of situation here, right? This is like the screen, right? This is what we actually see. And then there's like an apron around it of stuff that wants to be simulated potentially at full resolution, maybe, right? I mean, I don't know, but let's say that there is. So basically everything inside here is like full resolution sim. This is full res sim, right? But then everything in the rest of the world, so everything that's not in that apron area, everything else I want to basically be low res sim. So that basically we could have, if we wanted to have 10,000 entities out here that weren't really doing anything too important in terms of their like second-to-second stuff, but we still want to simulate them. Maybe they're on routes, they're going places and picking up stuff, or doing some kind of planning about what they want to do, those sorts of things. They're still doing things, but they're not necessarily doing them with the same kind of resolution as these, where they're actually doing like full pathfinding and trying to walk around and look realistic as they do it, or attack the player and those sorts of things, right? So I'm thinking that that's sort of the thing here, and I don't know what this number is, right? I don't really realistically know what this number is. So one of the things that I don't know if I've really talked about too much in the series, I do it a lot. I don't know how useful they are, but I'm going to say one now because it's what I would do here. There's a thing called a back of the envelope, or BOTE, right? And it's back of the envelope calculation, right? And what it basically is I don't know why they call it back of the envelope. I have no idea where that actually comes from. I don't know if they're talking about envelope like, like in the sense of like a performance envelope, or whether they're talking about like this sort of thing. And like I use the back of an envelope to write down a calculation on that I didn't particularly care too much about. I have no idea. But point being, what it is it's kind of ballparking some computations to give you a sense of what might be possible, or to kind of guide your judgment, but that is not accurate to any real, like you couldn't use this calculation for any real purpose, because it's it's kind of just a very fudgy, it's a fudge factor kind of thing. And so what I'm kind of wondering is like, okay, how many entities might we have? Like, I don't know what that number is, right? How many entities? And so the way I like to do this sort of thing is I'll say, okay, well, let's say that realistically speaking, since this is a generated game, I feel like 8 hours is probably like pretty darn long for a gameplay session. Like I feel like 8 hours is way longer than you might ever probably want to play a generated, like Java generated games are like 4 or 5 hours. But I mean, if we were to go crazy, you could imagine someone for some reason, and I have no idea why, wants to generate a 60-hour experience and play like like a Final Fantasy length kind of thing or whatever. And then also you could think the more typical play time is maybe 2 hours, right? 1 to 2 hours. Like I want to generate a little game, I want to play it, I want to have some fun. I don't want it to take all weekend, right? And so I feel like that's a pretty reasonable range of things. Like, that's the min-max. This is probably the most typical. This is probably less typical. And this is probably, I don't know that we ever even care, but it's something to think about to see what that kind of maximum bound is. Like, is anyone ever going to play 60 hours of one game of Handmade Hero, knowing that they could die at any time and be done and have to start a whole new one? I don't know. I don't know. But point being, so if I think about that...
I can only guess at what he is envisioning the ultimate game to look like. Because if he's suspecting that 8 hours is like, kind of the window of time that you imagine playing a full game of Handmade Hero, I feel like that informs the kind of game you're making a lot more than you might guess. Like the length of time, I think about all of the games I've played hundreds of hours of, and a single game is like one round, right? Think of like a Counter-Strike or something like that, where it's like less than 5 minutes to play one round of the game, right? And you're on a map, and I mean, maybe there's more, there's one round, but then a whole game is like 8 rounds or something like that. And so that might be more like half an hour, right? Or 45 minutes, whatever that number boils out to roughly. If every round is about 5 minutes or less, and you have 8 rounds, that's about 40 minutes, right? So I think that this allusion to time and how long it takes to play the game, maybe there's just a lot more to unpack there than just like, is this game going to be played for 60 hours or 2 hours? I don't know. It's also abstract, so maybe it's not even worth having the conversation. But it's just, I keep thinking of, because there's building the thing, and I think this is the thing that Casey struggled with a lot as he got deeper and deeper into the series, is without like a design to hone in on, you really can just go balls to the walls and build all of the cool stuff that you can imagine. And maybe that's just a problem that that's a trap that engine programmers fall into, because I don't think, it seems like a stereotype almost, where, people talk about, I've been working on my game engine for years, and like, there's just no game here. I have all this cool capability. Like, how do you actually start making that game that you want to create take shape? You have to think less and less about all the cool things you could do, and more about like, what is the actual thing that the game is supposed to be.
And I say, well, okay, realistically speaking, how many enemies do you encounter typically per minute? Because, if we look at these, right, what is that? That's 3,600 minutes or something like this that the person's playing for.
And I guess if I was to try and draw an analogy to this, like in my world, the world that I'm coming from, right, where I develop business applications in the form of websites or web apps, like there's no limit to the number of cool things I could do technologically, where something is really complex and has all these cool features and blah blah blah, but if nobody cares, right, like I just spent a lot of time dreaming up and creating something that nobody has any interest in using. And to a very real extent, I've done plenty of that over the years, working on not so much with my day job but with my startup. And I think that's a problem, because that's a problem that makes sense for me to encounter in that arena where I'm working on my own company. I can't have all the freedom, right, to do whatever I want. And that's a double-edged sword, because not only can I do whatever I want, I'm not held down by all this red tape and bureaucracy, I'm also limited by my own ability to determine what it is I should actually do that people are going to want to pay for, right?
And in this case, right, it's what, 480 minutes? I don't know, I'm bad with mental math. These are probably all wrong. 20 minutes, right? So we're looking at something that's between 120 and 3,600 minutes of playtime, right? That's what we're looking at here. And so if you're talking about how many enemies this player will encounter, even if they were encountering some very high rate of monsters for this type of game, it's like a Zelda kind of walk around game. You're talking 4, 5, 6 enemies on a screen at a time is already getting a little chaotic for the player to deal with, really, if there's enemies that are all meaningful and aren't just kind of throwaway. So, even if we're talking about something like 10 monsters per screen, which is really high, right? So if we said something like 10 monsters per screen, where we were talking about, that's a pretty heavy rate, and we were talking about, maybe even 2 screens a minute, so figure 20 monsters a minute. At 20 monsters a minute, you're already, encountering them. You're already talking about really less than this number I already was talking about here, right? That's like 72... oh, no, that's a little more. Never mind, that's a little more. 72,000, is that correct? Right? You add the 0, and then you multiply by 2. So 72,000. So there you go. 72,000 would be if we were going to play 60 hours encountering 20 monsters a minute. I think I did that right. So 72,000 entities, right, would be roughly what that is. And that's kind of a pretty massive number of entities. And so let's think about that number a little bit, right? If we had 72,000 entities, and we're talking about this 20 per minute thing, well, how many screens really are there going to be here? If there's 9, even if there was something like, even if you're talking about maybe 30 hot screens, you're talking about in that working set of entities, you're talking about maybe 600 entities tops, but we're probably talking about a lot less than that, right? I mean, we're probably talking about something more in the range of like 100 to 200 entities that are in that hot range. So we're talking about simulating maybe 100 to 200 entities per frame at the full resolution, which seems like a totally doable number, right? And that doesn't seem too particularly difficult there at all. And that feels pretty high. But even if it was 600, that doesn't seem like too bad, right? Especially because a lot of them are off scene, so we don't even have to draw them. We just have to know what they were doing. So that seems totally doable, not really a big deal, right? This number, however, in terms of how many are stored externally, is a bit of a big deal because if you sort of think about how we might want to deal with that, if you were actually simulating 72,000 guys per frame, well, one thing that you can do pretty easily, again, this is sort of that back of the envelope computation stuff. If I whip open the calculator here and I say, okay, on a 3 gigahertz machine, that's 3 times 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000, right? That's how many cycles I've got, and I'm running at 60 frames a second, right? So that's per second. So per frame, if I was running at 60 frames a second, let's say, I would have, what is that, about 50 million cycles? Does that sound about right? So I'd have 50 million cycles is the total number of cycles that I'd actually have, right? So I'd have 50 million cycles per frame to do all the work that I need to do, right? And so if you think about taking the 72,000, right, and I divide my my number of cycles by the number of entities, you're down to a really tiny, like 700 cycles per entity is just not going to happen, right? It's just totally out of the question, because 700 cycles, I mean, that's only a couple memory fetches, a couple things out of the cache, and you're already at 700 cycles, right? So we pretty much know that number is never going to happen. So if we want to scale to that number of entities, we need to have something in mind that's going to handle this. And so what I expect to do, what I think is the easiest thing to do, right, is to just update these guys at a much lower latency, a much lower frequency rather than everything else. So once people move out of the hot zone, what I want to do then is say, okay, from then on, once people are outside of that hot zone, what I want to do is say they are now going to update, at some kind of a, let's say 1,000 a frame or something like that, or potentially even less. Because
one thing that still isn't clear to me, this is my second time watching this through, so I'm hearing him say this, and I'm trying to understand the justification for wanting to have 72,000 entities that exist, but are updated slowly, right? I'm trying to figure out the justification for it beyond, hey, we can just do this. Like, let's just do it to show that we can have that many entities that exist and are doing something in the far reaches of the world. I can appreciate the doing it for the sake of doing it, because that's basically what the whole point of this stream is, I think. So I can't say that that's not a good reason to set out and build something that can do this. But I know that he walks back some notion of I think he has he winds up with initially 3 tiers of active, right, for an entity. There's the entity is local and it's on the screen effectively. And then there's the apron that he talks about where they're still active, but they aren't fully active. And then there's the dormant space way outside of that. And I think he starts out with 3 tiers and then walks it back to just having 2. We have a bunch of entities far out in the world that are active, not active, and then there are some just kind of in the locality of the player, just off of screen in that apron that he's talking about. Hey, Skytrius. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. So anyway, I just noticed my chat's working, so that's good. So anyway, I'm trying to just think about that. If you had, say, a big world where you wanted to just have entities exist in the far reaches of it, and let's say it wasn't procedurally generated, and instead you wanted those entities, those mobs or creatures, whatever, to simply show up once the player gets into a certain part of the world. You could save that state to a file, right? And then maybe read it in as the player gets closer or something. But maybe that gets into an issue where that's just too slow to do things that way. Hard for me to be too concrete about that, because I'm just, I'm not there with my understanding of, coming from the web world, I have a good intuitive sense for when something is going to be a bad idea for performance reasons. I don't have that for games yet. Devil said, so enemies can be constructing little camps and collecting items to forge weapons as you're playing, like the scouts of enemy civs in the Civilization games. I think that's basically the capability that he wants to facilitate, right, by architecting things this way. And so that way it would be dynamic in the sense that the entities are dormant and they're out there and their state is updating as you're playing the game and you're walking through and encountering entities locally. But far out there, they're, getting better weapons, they're gathering resources, they're maybe building their fortress or whatever, however, you imagine the game should look, versus it being prefabbed and handcrafted, no, this is this encounter and we're designing this encounter up front. We're going to have this many big bulky enemies. We're going to have this many archers. We're going to have this many little grunts. I'm thinking I'm going to be framing all of my understanding of how you would handcraft encounters through the Halo games, because that's just kind of the franchise that I grew up on and developed a strong love for games through. And in each of those encounters in the Halo games, they're never dynamic in the sense that you're going to encounter a totally different structure of the enemies there. The enemies are all placed the way they're at according to the environment and what the level designers decided. This is the number of elites that the player should encounter. This is the level that the elite should be at based on the difficulty you're at. But another thing I'll hear Casey and I think Jonathan Blow talk about as well is that when a game has a difficulty level, it means you haven't thought hard enough about the game design to make it so that you just have the one difficulty, right? But obviously it's worked really well for the Halo games for, and a lot of other games like Call of Duty. What is the highest difficulty on Call of Duty? I'm just trying to, there's a whole lot of things that I'm trying to untangle by working through this. These maybe just aren't the right things to be thinking about learning game engine stuff, right? But you can't help that game engine stuff is inextricably tied to game design, right? You need both halves. You can't talk about one in isolation almost. Maybe you can talk about design in isolation if you're just postulating about what what does this game look like if we could do anything, if we had the technology, if we knew how to build the technology. But it's hard to justify, again, developing a game engine component without some sort of purposeful design in mind, I guess. Maybe that's just what he was really struggling with towards the end of the series, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a ton of value to be gleaned from just learning, going about things the way he's going about them, and thinking about if I did need to do this, how would I do it? So we'll go ahead and do it like we've been doing it all along.
At 1,000 a frame, it would roughly be 1 second. I'd update every entity like once a second, right? And once a second seems like enough for entities who are just kind of doing things with each other. They're basically just doing stuff outside of the world. And, some portion of these entities might be able to go to sleep completely if they're entities that don't do anything. Like they're entities that don't have any evolving behavior that could make them do something that we care about. Then we don't have to worry about them at all, right? So really, this is just, sort of a ballpark number. Now, the other thing
I hate to keep rambling about this, but it just keeps hitting me. It hits me in moments listening to him talk about it more. I can think of a perfectly good reason why I'd want to have this functionality for some of the game themes that I'm toying with, and keeping in my back pocket and trying to understand how would I even convey any sort of message about these themes through gameplay, right? And I can think of a perfect, like the civilization stuff is actually a good example of that, right? Because as you're doing things in the world, and I've never played the Civ games really, so my understanding of this is very surface level. But basically, as you're working to build up your civilization and you're making trades and you're going to war with these other countries in your playthrough, right? Other countries are doing the same thing, and it's all like the game's AI is deciding and reacting based off of the things you're doing. And these are some of the same, I want the same kind of mechanic, but the way that I want that to come through and the way that gameplay even looks like would be totally different from Civ, right? But it's still kind of the same underlying notion that you're doing things in there. And what he's talking about here, those entities in the far reaches of the game world that are dormant and things are happening. I don't know if maybe he's going to go ahead and say this, and this is just going to confirm what I'm thinking. But like, as you're making gameplay decisions and you're working through each room, right? Every choice that you make as far as the items you're getting maybe, or the skills you're upgrading or whatever. And I don't even know if that's necessarily like, if he has like a skill tree in mind or anything like that, maybe not with this game. Maybe it's all going to be more like, you learn the mechanics of the game and maybe you unlock new mechanics, but there's no like upgrading of skills in different directions so that the way that you play the game changes, right? And if I'm thinking more about like a Zelda game, generally Zelda just kind of gives you these skills and you unlock different aspects of it, but you can't say be like Wizard Link, right, in one playthrough and then be melee combat Link in another playthrough. Like these are just the array. This is just the array of things you have available to you, and you get the items, you unlock the abilities, right? I'm thinking of like Wind Waker, where you come across like new items that just unlock another dimension to the combat, as well as the puzzle solving, right? And that's just what's available to you. And I'm guessing that's more what he has in mind. But anyway, we're so far off from implementing any of that, right? So got to start somewhere.
have to think about here is storage for these guys, right? At this rate, basically, this is 72,000 entities, right? So 72K. So, it's probably really not that big a deal. But if we actually were starting to think about, well, we want to be able to sort of save the game or stuff like this, it becomes a little tricky because at 72,000, well, how big is each of those? If each of one was, say, 1 kilobyte large, you'd be at 72 megabytes of memory just for the entities that are not in, that are just kind of sitting there, which on today's machines is nothing. Like I said, that's totally meaningless, so we could totally do it. It's not a problem. But we do have to think about it a little bit for like saving the game. Do we want the save game file to be 72 megs, right? And I mean, like I said, I don't know that we're supporting save games per se, but we might support like closing the app and reopening it again. And so you're starting to wonder if that's maybe such a good idea. I don't know. It probably doesn't matter. But point being, something to think about. So sort of what I'm thinking here is saying, okay, what I want to do is I want to say we're going to have these two things. This is how I've been thinking about it in my head, what we've kind of got out here. So what I want to do is I want to say that we've got sort of one set that's a relatively small set, and then one set that's a pretty big set. And these are the low frequency entities, right? And these are the high frequency entities. And what I want to do is, as the player moves around the world, what I would like to do is essentially move, right, entities from the low frequency set into the high frequency set, right? So they kind of they come this way as they become on screen, right? Or I shouldn't say on screen. I should say like as they move in range. So because I'll probably start simulating them a little bit further out. And that's just for stuff like if you want to be able to hear things in the next room that are happening, right? Or stuff like that. Maybe we want them to be simulated a little higher acuity, right? So there's the high frequency set, and they move in when they come out of in range, and then things will similarly get moved, out to the low frequency set when they are out of range, right? So that's really all I really want to be able to do. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about addressing here, because this is kind of something that's relatively important. What I wanted to say was, so entities can have behaviors that are that revolve around or need to think about other entities, right? Pretty obvious. Like, for example, if one entity has decided to attack another entity, then typically you need some way, you basically need some kind of a pointer, right? That is, from one entity to another entity, how do I remember, the entity I was talking about, right? Another example would be like a familiar, like if someone's following the player, like an aid, a support player, a support entity. How does it know who it's following? Because like I said, we're kind of supporting multiple players. We don't know if we'll have multiple players in the game eventually, but we want to do it right. And similarly, maybe the same thing could happen for monsters. Like maybe monsters can have familiars too, right? So we want to be able to support kind of a generic concept of like, I am following this guy. Well, in order to follow...
He's talking, again, about the engine side of it, the implementation side of it, and he's talking about it not super concretely, but he's going on about addressing and pointers. One entity has a pointer to another entity, this sort of thing. What I was just talking about a moment ago, like with respect to whether you unlock different abilities and then the game is just prefab to test your understanding of those new mechanics as you unlock them. This is different from like if you choose to be Magic Link, right? Or you're choosing to be have like a wizard archetype that you're trying to build, and you're using spells versus melee. At the end game, right? Then those entities that you're going to face at the end game should test you like as a wizard versus being, more towards a melee build, right? It's like they're saying, oh, he's choosing. The entities are reacting and saying, oh, he's building more of like a wizard character. Then the combat that the player encounters once they get to that stage of the game with that kind of a wizard build should be interesting in those ways versus them just being able to roll over them, because doing that section of the game would be much harder as a melee build. And I'm going back to Halo. Halo is another example of this, where you don't really choose any sort of like skill tree. And I guess in the latest one you kind of do, but it's pretty shallow. It's not very wide, and it's not very deep as far as like that skill tree goes. You just kind of, and it's honestly more in this way where you just kind of unlock different capabilities, and it kind of expands the extent to which the different choices you can make when you choose to approach a fight, right, in the game. And I guess I'm trying to, while understanding how to build this thing, have a better appreciation for the ramifications I can have on the gameplay that you're able to tease out of building those things. It'd be like natural selection. The enemies weak to magic were all killed and failed to pass on their builds. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Like, and that's like that might be like a good low-hanging fruit thing for me to try and go and implement once we get that far, right? Like, what does that look like to try and build something where if I play as a mage for an hour, the enemies that I encounter react to me as a mage versus being a melee player? They've got magic resist, and they can put up force fields, and they can do stuff that drains my magicka. And in that sense, it might feel frustrating, because like I know some other games do have enemies that will just naturally be harder or easier for you to fight as a mage. Maybe that's the wrong application to think about things in this way for that type of game, And I guess I'm thinking of like Elden Ring is another example of just a game that I played where some enemies become really tedious to fight if you're choosing a mage build or a melee build, whatever. I always tried to force things to work with the big sword build past a certain point, and I think the only build that I chose that I actually completed the game with was some it was like a dual wielded like sword thing where he could throw down like a wall of flames just over and over again, and it was really OP. But that was just mostly born out of my lack of a willingness to learn Elden Ring's mechanics the hard way. I was just like, oh, this build's OP. I'm just going to find those items. I'm going to use this build, and then I'm going to go and roll over everything. I guess what I would try to do is have a game be rewarding in that way, where it doesn't feel like the enemies reacting to you and, you know, doing that process of natural selection amongst themselves to resist your build better. I want that to be more fun, right? You want that to be more fun and be more interesting to play versus just frustrating. It's like, oh, I'm putting all this work into building a good mage and all the enemies are good or are resistant. But that's more, if you can do that without making it really frustrating, then you might have something a little more novel, perhaps, maybe. And I can't think of a game off the top of my head. Like in Skyrim, it would just be like the enemies, if your difficulty is pushed higher, and then the deeper, the higher level you get, regardless of the build you choose, the enemies just get spongier, right? And they do more damage, and it's not very interesting. You know, the types of enemies don't change to react to your build, I guess. But anyway, we've gone on too long about this, but it's just stuff that I'm trying to think a little bit harder about, and because I think it's more elusive, right? Like Casey is paving the way for us to learn how to build a whole bunch of game engine stuff, but at the end of that, we have to use that knowledge and actually build games with it, right?
Somebody, right? I obviously need a way of saying who the person is that I'm following. And so we have this need to basically do addressing of some kind, where inside these structures, we have the ability to discuss other entities, right? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to have some stable addressing scheme, because you can see why this gets a little confusing. If I have high frequency and low frequency entities, right, then one thing I definitely don't want to do is have to loop over this entire low frequency set, right, every frame, just to find which ones are high frequency, right? And similarly, I may not even want to store, because like I said, that 72 megs is looking a little bit dicey there. I don't know if I want to store all 72 megabytes of that. So if the actual information necessary to process a guy at high frequency happens to be very detailed and has like his animation state and all this sort of stuff, I don't necessarily want to store all that in here either, right? So I've kind of got this situation where I have a number of competing concerns that I need to work out, and it would probably be best for performance and just in general for space efficiency as well if we could have entities exist in either place and be able to address them correctly no matter which one they're in. So basically be able to say, I am pointing to an entity somehow, I am following entity blah, and know that I can figure out the things I need to figure out about him without having to always search one or the other or do anything weird, and without forcing me to have everything in a giant index table or anything like that, right? So I'd like to have a scheme that does that. And I think probably, since the low frequency table basically has all the entities in it, for the most part, I think probably, well, it's very hard to say, right? The real question is how we want to handle dormant entities. But let's say that every entity is always simulated for now. We'll put this question aside temporarily.
Okay, so I was wondering, he's talking about high frequency and low frequency entities, and that's only two kind of stages or states that an entity can be in as far as like the extent to which they're active in the game world. So that's what he does. He has high frequency, low frequency, and then dormant. Those are the three different kind of states that an entity can be in. But I'm pretty sure he rips out low frequency, and it just becomes, you know, either an entity is active and actively being updated every single loop, or it's dormant and it only gets updated, you know, every X number of frames.
But let's say that we wanted every entity in the game to always be active. That's just something we're going to do in the game. Every entity has a behavior, every entity has stuff that happens to them, and they're always kind of possible to be used. If that was the case, then I know that basically my low frequency table always has all the entities in it. So what I could do for my addressing is basically just address into the low frequency table always, and then if there's a high frequency, if that person's actually in the high frequency table, I just store something at the head of that sort of says like, oh, you know, he's in the high frequency table, and here's where he is, right, let's say. I could do something like that. The other thing I could do is have a separate table that's totally transient and isn't stored, that just says who's in high frequency and who's in low frequency, right? So you always look, there's always a 72,000 entry table, right, out here that has all the entities in it, and basically all it is just a pointer, or just, you know, like a information that says whether it's in the high frequency or low frequency table and where it is, right? And then every time someone moves from one to the other, we update this. So there's different ways that I could do that. The bonus of doing it this way, and maybe this is the right way, is that we can also have dormant entities, which is to say that entities that are in here, they're in neither table. right? It's like the entity just doesn't even exist anymore. Maybe it's in some like dormant table, which literally just stores where it was. So the only thing that's in there is the location, so that when it moves in range, it can move from this table into this table, into the high frequency table. But it like never actually has to have its be processed in the low frequency table.
Okay. I keep on going back and forth on whether me chiming in between him talking about this stuff is remotely interesting or worth talking about. But I think this confirms for me that it is worth talking about, because he just basically said if an entity is not, high frequency, and therefore it's not being actively updated within, the range of the player, right? Maybe it's just off screen, and like he's saying, you can hear it making its little zombie sounds or whatever it is. And then if it's low frequency, it's outside of that immediate border where the player is, but it still has state other than its location that's being updated. But he's saying that if an entity is dormant, so it's way out there towards the edges of the game world, or at least the edges of the game world that we care to force the player to go through to complete the game, but those don't store anything other than, right, its location. Now, maybe you don't need to store anything other than that, because as the player gets deeper into the game, right, by the time it reaches those entities that were dormant and all they had was a location, the game loop can look at the player's build and be like, what's the state of this player's build? Here's the type of entities, right, that the player ought to encounter based off of that build. Just for sake of, because you don't need to store all that information. You don't need to start tracking that stuff at the end of the game, right, when the player's only just started, and because you're not going to have that information about what choices the player has made for their build, gameplay wise, until they get to that stage. So this would actually probably work just fine, like he's saying, just storing the location and not anything else, way out there in let's say, a million tile rooms away. Not that the player would ever want to go that far, because you'd just be walking and walking and walking. Like, how long would it realistically even take to do that? Not even a million, like a billion. Like you said, we have, well, is it a billion tile rooms or is it 4 billion tiles? I guess it's not that important. The point is it's a really big freaking world.
Right. So I don't know. That's a good question. But the fact that I'm even thinking about it suggests to me that probably we would want to start with a 3-table scheme, so that we know that we could support dormant entities correctly. And then if we find that it's not necessary, we could collapse down to the 2-table scheme. But basically, like, what I'm trying to say here is I'm a little worried that baking it into this table is a bit of a premature optimization, and I'll be sorry later that I did that, because I'll want it to be more flexible in various ways or whatever, right? So that's what I'm thinking right now. That's roughly the way I'm thinking about it. And so this high-frequency table would store everyone in float space. It would be float space based around wherever the camera is at the moment. And whenever the camera moved, we'd just update all of the entities in here to have that offset probably, or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how we want to do that. I'll have to think about that later. But this would basically always be float space, and these would always be in tile space, right? And that would get us completely out of the business of having those sort of annoying 2-tiered coordinate systems, because we'd still have the coordinate system that we worked out, and it would still be working correctly, but we would no longer have to worry about dealing with them both at the same time. We'd always only deal with one in low frequency and only in float in the other, and there'd just be one very clearly defined place where we do that transition. And that, I think would make it, first of all, very bug-free, right? Because I feel like we've already had bugs that involved having to deal with those two at the same time, because of the canonicalization and all that junk. And so just being entirely in float over here would be great, and I think it would eliminate a huge source of bugs. It would also eliminate a huge source of frustration of having to deal with these special coordinate systems and all that sort of stuff, because we would know that we would just always be in tiles here, which are just integer tile indices, and we'd always be in float over here, and never the twixt shall meet, right? So that seems pretty good to me. I feel like that's pretty reasonable. And so I feel like that's probably what I would start with, and then I'll have to think about what these tables look like. We'll have to evolve as we decide what we want to do for our entity system, but this seems like a little bit of a better approach to me. And so similarly, over in the high frequency side of things, not necessarily in the entity table, but in addition to the entity table, I feel like it would also be all of the sort of stuff in the environment in that area as well, right? So all of the, basically everything that we are doing for the game would kind of be in here, that's in that sort of apron would be in here, like where all the trees are, where the shop is, where the grasses are, all that sort of stuff would all kind of be this thing in that apron. And then when we sort of go and it gets sort of moved out, we just say that's the end of it.
I just keep on thinking about more and more ramifications, because if you get, from one end of the game world to some substantial way into the world where these other entities that were high frequency when you started are now dormant towards the middle of the game or whatever, if for whatever reason you wanted to come back, and the game, kind of game he's talking about, I suspect you would never go all the way back to that starting place, but then what becomes of like anything that was back there? Like, I'm putting this in terms of like other games, like a Minecraft, where let's say you build like a home base by your spawn point, and then you go off and you wander until you find the biome that you actually want to build your home base at. Like, you still have to have everything, be all that state stored about where, you know, your original home base looked like. When it goes dormant, you can't just slash all of that, you know, stuff about it beyond like just where it's located and perhaps what kind of entity it is. And I don't know, a lot of this is, I'm probably thinking too much about this at this point, just because so much of this is abstract for me, and it'll be more concrete as we move on. But I guess the thing that is worth observing for me is that I'm thinking about this more in terms of like how it'll actually affect the game, whereas last time thinking about things this technically, you know, in terms of high frequency versus low frequency versus dormant, like couldn't really put it together, the ramifications that would have on the game at the time. And maybe that's just because I wasn't talking about rubber ducking, you know, I was just kind of trying to soak in the information. But so much of learning something is actually like engaging with the information, you know, and part of it was also born out of impatience for me, where it's like, I'm just, you know, I want to write some code, Casey, get to the code. You know, but just writing the code isn't enough.
Okay. So really, the only thing that I'm not still sure about exactly how I want to do is sort of the, I'm not really sure how I want to handle the re-offsetting part of things, right? So there's a way we could cheese it, but I'm not really interested in cheesing it. So I want to talk about it a little bit. So let's suppose, right? Let's suppose that I'm looking at this screen here, and the hot region that's being simulated is like one screen around me on all sides, right? And I don't know if diagonals are in there as well, but you know, something like this. So you figure there are 9 screens, like I said, potentially 27 screens if we wanted to think about vertical as well. I don't know if we do or not. But basically there's some number of screens that are in the hot set here. And everything outside of here, right, all this is the wasteland, that's all in the low frequency table. So when something comes from the low frequency table into the high frequency table, right, it's simple enough. We just say, where is the camera looking, right? This, you know, let's say we just moved here. So this tile, you know, we just moved one to the right. You know, we did that motion. And so now these guys are coming into that hot set. They were previously dormant. So we gather all the things that are in here, right? And we go ahead and we say, where are they relative to that camera location, you know, and we place them, right? So now we've got all of the things that are there and they're in float space, right? So what we created, you know, is a local coordinate system where we can do everything, and we know that we have plenty of float precision because it's a very tiny little world. So it doesn't matter how giant our actual world is. The real world that we're simulating will if anything, be smaller than most games' full coordinate systems. So we'll have even more precision than most games have, right? Because we're in this tiny space. And so, you know, that all works out great, and it allows us to have as giant a world as we want and never have to worry about float precision, and still do everything in float so that we don't have any performance penalty either, which is all nice. But we do have one performance problem. Well, it's not necessarily a performance problem, but one performance concern. The problem is, what happens when we move again? So when the guy moves here, right? So this is now the new center. Well, what do we do with all of these guys, right? All of their floating point positions, if we were always going to make them be centered around the camera, right? They all have to be updated. So basically, everything in the high frequency table essentially has to be updated when we do that move. And so I don't know. I mean, is that a problem? Is that not a problem? I mean, how many entities in here would we have to have for that move to be an issue? I don't know. You know, if there was 1,000 guys, we're talking about basically an add. We're talking about, you know, a SIMD add, where you've got, you know, an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate or something, and we're just full on adding another X, Y, Z. So we're talking about like one SIMD op, but we got to kind of go through it all, you know, for all the guys or whatever. And so, you know, if we have to offset 1,000 of them when we move, is that a big deal, right? And I don't think it is. I think we can basically do that in a very trivial number of cycles. You know, what if we push that? How high would that have to be before we care? I don't think that much. I'm just worried about, like, let's say each individual tree, you know, in this world is being done that way, you know, something like that. Yeah. So I don't know. It's something to think about is the point. And so I'm not sure about that part. But what it does suggest to me as well is that high frequency table might want to be stored in a way where you kind of have some sort of a notion of the X, Y, the X's, the Y's, and the Z coordinates that are stored you know, in a way that's very efficient to bulk process for addition, because that may be one of the biggest operations we do as we move left to right or that sort of thing. But anyway, something to think about. So that's about it. I think that's really the only sort of snafu of the plan in my mind, where things are not 100% obvious that they're good. That part is a little wonky, right? So that's a little bit wonky. And there's a couple other things that are not super clear about this, right? I'm not sure how we deal with the fact that, like, so there's dormant entities, or not dormant, but low frequency entities out here. So there's a question of how people ask about how low frequency and high frequency entities see each other. You know, maybe they don't really, but I mean, let's pick an absolutely ridiculous example. Like, say that there's the concept that whether I can see this or hear this guy or not, and he made a sound, and this guy knows about it, but they're in different spaces, right? So, you know, is there something that basically allows us to easily push simulation stuff out and in from the two different kinds of people who are being simulated here, right? And I don't know. So that's just something, again, to think about. I don't really know how we're going to deal with that stuff too much. It's a little bit tricky. For the stuff that's on the main screen, it doesn't seem like much of a problem, because it's unlikely that people will be thinking about guys that are multiple screens away in terms of what they're doing exactly. So I think that we're probably safe for all of the gameplay interactions that actually happen, but it's what happens to that apron that's a little bit confusing. So again, we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. We certainly haven't gotten to the point now where I have enough information to really know what I would do there. So there you go. That's my full brain dump on like how I'm thinking about this stuff, if that makes sense. But
it's making me think of something that I can't help but just laugh about when he's talking about this idea. So he's talking about, as you're moving through the world, and we got to update all these entities that are active around the player because they're within range of the player, and we got to update their X, Y, and Z. But I'm thinking it's making me think of, okay, not just updating the X, Y, and Z, but the state of that entity is changing over time. And the example I've been using up to this point is like, how the enemy entities in the game react to the build you've chosen, right? Or whatever. Somehow it makes the gameplay more interesting as you get deeper into the game, because the kinds of enemies that you encounter, they react based on the build you've chosen. But I'm thinking of another example that is super simple and I think strikes at the heart of what I'm trying to talk about, but is also just funny because it is kind of like, it was something that was memed pretty heavily when I was younger, and I remember reading about it, and that was like the promise that Peter Molyneux made to potential buyers of the original Fable games, where he talked about, you'll be able to plant an acorn in the beginning of the game, and then you'll go off and you'll adventure, and then you'll come back to your hometown where you planted that acorn, and it'll be a tree. Like, that is the thing. How do I make that actually interesting enough to where it's not just like some thing that he said for marketing reasons and then it never actually went into the game, right? Like, you can do something similar in Minecraft. You plant your sapling and it becomes a tree, over the course of several days in Minecraft. But I guess I'm more interested in making that more interesting than just like this thing grows and then you can chop it down for more resources. So anyway, that's like, I think back on that, and I think he was like answering questions about that, because that was Fable 1. He was promising, oh, you'll be able to plant an acorn and it'll grow into a tree by the end of the game. He was promising that for Fable 1. And I think he was getting questions about that when he was doing marketing for Fable 2, right? And then he said, oh, in this game, you'll actually be able to do it. And maybe you actually could plant an acorn and watch it grow into a tree by the end of the game in Fable 2. I actually don't remember, but it's entirely possible that you couldn't do that in Fable 2 either. But and as funny as that is, and as much as people were right to give him a whole lot of shit for advertising something that didn't wind up in the end product, I still enjoyed Fable. I still enjoyed the first game quite a bit. The second game I also enjoyed quite a bit, although maybe not as much. Changing entire biomes. There could be propagation, so a tree you could plant would make a forest. Yes, exactly. Right. That sounds familiar. To some of the things that he would hint at, like being able to do. But that is more of like the direction I'd like to go in, where maybe there's something there, and also how it impacts like the entities that like, let's say a forest propagates itself. The kinds of animals that would start to form habitats within that forest would be different based on the kind of tree, right? But then there's other things, like it shouldn't be as easy as planting a sapling that would then propagate itself to then make a forest. Like, there's also all these other environmental stuff, the things that could go wrong based on the other things that you're doing. So you go and plant that acorn, but then if you go and then route the water off and make a dam to take the water to build a town with it or whatever, then that tree that maybe needed that water that was coming from it, getting way off topic here, but that's exactly the direction I would try to go in. It's just, how do you do that in a way that makes it interesting gameplay wise, right? And on some level, I think it makes me think about, what if I just made it more like a sim game? Because that's kind of how it sounds like when you talk about this thing, this sort of thing. It actually reminds me of another game. I think it was Peter Molyneux also. What was it called? Goddess. I think that game may have been trying to do something similar to this, but I'm not sure. too bad the squirrel population migrated because of what you did 2 tiles away and ate that acorn. Like, how deep do we got to go? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's I still don't understand it myself. Like, and I'm not sure how interesting that actually is. I'm just trying to think of outside of, like, I think that part of the reason why playing games got really boring for me as I got older is because I started seeing basically the same thing in every game. And I think that games can be a lot more than just, like, you know, like I think about Counter-Strike. It's been the same game for like 30 years or something like that, 25 years. I want to say that we should be able to make something that is novel for games in a way that is not just derivative of something else that worked. Isn't Dwarf Fortress, the game, legendary for how deep it goes? I don't know. You know, maybe my problem is I've been playing the wrong games, and there's actually games out there that are doing novel things that I haven't been exposed to for whatever reason. Maybe, you know, it's not that I only pay attention to AAA games, but I'm very certain there's like a wide variety of indie stuff that I haven't been exposed to. And that's kind of also what I'm hoping doing this stream will expose me to, as people hopefully give me recommendations of what to try. Like, I don't know how deep Dwarf Fortress is. I don't know if I've ever even played it, but now I'm going to go and look into that. I'm looking, it's a hard balance to find because I don't really have a whole lot of time to play games. When it comes down to it, if I'm between wanting to spend more time gaming or programming, I'm going to choose programming. But at some point I need to think about getting inspiration from other games, and I don't know, it's a whole other thing, but there's that tipping point will come. I just don't know when I'll focus more on that. Cats ended up dying en masse because they stepped in spilled alcohol, and the paw licking implemented for cats caused them to die from alcohol poisoning. See, I think that's exactly the type of thing that I'm talking about. That's pretty interesting. It's like it's like it's like what surprises the player when something happens and you're not expecting it as a player, because you just assume that you understand all of the aspects of the game and the mechanics and the systems that are all involved, and then you see something that you don't expect, right? It gives you like this moment of like, oh my gosh, I understand what can happen more deeply now. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, how can you make a game, and it sounds like Dwarf Fortress might be something to look at there, but anyway. Lots of talking in the stream. I keep yabbering. I think we're finally about to write some code.
If we kind of look at what we've got already, it's not like there's all that much work to do to sort of get us there, or at least to sort of get us started on what's going to happen there. So here's our way that we're drawing entities, right? And basically what we're doing now is we're constantly computing that difference from the camera. So we're constantly saying, where is this relative to the camera? And so really all I'm saying is that now what we would do instead of that is we'd say, okay, let's actually go ahead and always just store the entities relative to the camera if they're in that set or not, right? So what I want to do is kind of bifurcate these here. I want to say that I've got, maybe we'll call it a high entity or an HF entity or an LF entity. I don't know, something like that. I'm not really sure what I would call these exactly. But high entity and low entity, I'm not sure. There really isn't a particularly good naming for them, I guess. But if you imagine we've got these, right, then my low frequency entities and my high frequency entities would only just have a v2 for their position, right? And I guess we haven't really talked about what we're going to do about z. I don't know if we want to kind of make this start to be a three-dimensional vector there. We kind of got to think about exactly how we're going to deal with three-dimensional. But for now, if we're only talking about 2 dimensions, we've essentially got this, where we've got the same stuff we had before with the width and height, phase direction, and all that sort of stuff. And then we've got the low frequency entities, which basically store the tile map position stuff, right? They're the ones who actually store this tile map position data. And we could start to eliminate that by saying we don't care about the offset anymore after it goes off screen. I'm not sure. We'll see how that goes. But anyway, so if we've got this, there's another thing we could think about as well, which is whether we want to keep the low frequency entities around so that the high frequency entity can basically reference stuff in the low frequency entity. And that would be an interesting idea as well. So let's say we also had the dormant entity, right? Let's see here. I'm gonna go ahead and call these low entity and high entity. So if we have the dormant entity as well, like dormant entity would definitely store the position, right? Because that's the thing that it needs to know. And then the low entity, I don't know exactly what that would store or whether it would store anything in addition to that necessarily, but it might be depending on what sort of entities you had, what kind of data it wants to remember. And then you'd have the high entity, which has more stuff yet. And so the question is, are these actually do you actually always have all 3 for an entity that's in the high entity space, and always have both for the low entities, and then sometimes only one for the dormant? So like, do these actually form sort of a composite piece, so that, for example, if the width and height of an entity is something that actually needs to be specified, then that's actually out in the dormant entity because it's something that you actually always need to persist, whereas something like the facing direction is not, so it's only in the high entity, for example, right? So you can see where I'm kind of thinking this through. I don't really know yet. And so this is a case where I'm going to write the usage code first, like I always say. We'll find out. But again, I'm just trying to write something here so I can start. So that's an example. Let's say we're doing something like that.
Yeah, so I don't remember how this winds up looking. I think it might just be like this goes away, and an entity is essentially either active, right, or dormant. And I won't pretend to know exactly what that looks like when he gets to that point, so we'll just stick to his implementation for now.
All right, so at first, to keep things simple, let's actually just have 3 tables that all have the same. So we'll have high entities, and we'll just do the exact same number for each of them for now. So low entity, right, and then dormant entity. Okay, and like I said, don't really know what's going to happen here, so we're just kind of playing around. So if we do that, then we can sort of say, all right, so just high entities are the only entities that we actually want. And so all we really need to know is whether or not an entity exists in that high entity table. So again, just doing the dumbest possible thing, we'll just store something here, just sort of a flags field or something, which is just like entity, some kind of, I don't know, entity residency or something like that, right? So there we go. And we'll say that our entity residency is just going to say basically which of those tables the entity is in at the moment. So we basically have a entity residence high, low, or dormant, right? Really, really simple. So entity residence, and I guess since I'm not,
I don't think I've had to declare an enum with Odin before, or enum, however you want to say it. I guess I should check out the Odin code base and see. So this is what you would call a tagged enum, right? Or is it just making the value explicit? My vocabulary is going to be off here, but basically I don't have to specify these integer values. I think I can just say, right, like high, low, dormant, like this, and I think that works. So this actually is, well, I guess I shouldn't assume where he's going to go with this, but we'll just go ahead and finish changing these. Yeah, I haven't used a single enum. This is the first one. I think I've done a union or two. Yeah. Well, that's not even... There we go. A raw union, no less. So, just haven't had that opportunity, but it's finally here. So I get to learn me some Odin tricks.
Backing anything else in there, I can literally just say that we've got that. So, if we got the entity residence, that would tell us which one it's in.
Okay, yeah. So this is going to have to be that enum type. Entity residence. We called it residence, not... oh, I didn't even finish naming this. Entity residence. Yeah, I suspect there's like lots of things that I could do with enums, right? That Casey doesn't use. Well, I think he uses them more and more as time goes on. But it just hasn't come up yet. He might have done it for something else that I wound up not needing it for. But that would be about it.
And so again, the really inefficient way of doing this is we'll just loop over them all and actually do it, and then we'll try to start splitting it out into a slight...
Thank you, Skytrius. I'll definitely ask for help, and it'll come up organically quite a bit too. It's just a lot. It's been a lot of blackboarding and a lot of more like math related stuff, just because of the collision detection and those sorts of things. Like there hasn't been a whole lot of Odin specific stuff recently. I got into more of that when I was doing the platform layer, I think. Trying to think of a good example. Well, a good example, like I had to surf the Odin Discord to figure out this little trick, to basically do this the same way that Casey does, where he just kind of specifies without this using keyword, right? He's able to specify that there's just a union, or rather there's a struct in here that maps to all the same memory, whether it's in an array or this struct. And I found out that Bill, the creator of Odin, actually wishes he didn't have this in the language. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when I wrote this, right, is I was like, I wonder if there's a way to do this that would not force me to use using. But as far as I can tell, right, that was the only way to do this thing. And the way I had to do it in Zig was basically just make it not like an anonymous union, right? It was... I just had to directly access, like, this had to have a name, essentially. It couldn't be anonymous, right? It had to be, you know, my buttons or whatever, and then this had to be, like, the list or the array. I can't remember what I named it. But then instead of having this nice way of accessing, you know, input dot move up button, right? It would have to be, like, buttons... And then it would have to be the map of my buttons. Apparently that's a keyword. I don't think I've, well, yeah, is that a keyword? I guess I haven't seen that either yet. So yeah, anyway. So nothing too tricky with respect to Odin has come up recently, but I'm sure it'll happen again. But that was one example of that I came across. It's mostly for C interop. You can maybe use an enum array in Odin for something like that. Okay. Well, in that case, I'll write it to do up here to explore that. Maybe use enum array for the buttons. Yeah. So definitely that's helpful. It's kind of one of those things where it's like, I don't want to use something incorrectly that is more Odin specific, I guess, because I don't want to develop the wrong, the inappropriate convention in my head for how I would do a thing. Like, I want to come across, like what I've said before on stream too, is that I want to get more and more comfortable exploring the Odin code base. And so when, just like I did a few moments ago, I decided to open up the Odin code base and just, you know, look at how you would declare an enum. And I think there will be an example where I do want to, you know, and maybe I'm saying this wrong, forgive me if I am, but tag it with a specific value. So that way, that I guess it's just so that, not a specific value, but a specific type, so that I know that, you know, the enum type that I'm getting out, right, of... And in this case, like I said, I don't think it matters for the entity resident stuff, but if we specifically wanted it to be a U32, like, so looking at examples like that inside of Odin's code base is just where I've defaulted to, because I have tried to not, I've gone out of my way to not bug people, because I feel like unless I'm really, really stuck on something, I shouldn't waste somebody else's time. That's just kind of the mantra I try to, you know, take when it comes to stuff like this, because I hate having my time wasted, specifically when it comes to things that I feel like if somebody just thought about it a little bit longer or a little bit harder, then they would have come to an answer. But I certainly do need help sometimes. So I can't figure it on my own. I can't just discern that convention by looking at example code. And it's usually when I get to that point where I'm like looking at code of how something is done, and I can kind of see it, but I can't really get the lesson out of it of like how I should be using this. Then that's where I do try to ask for help. Your enum button state, then it could be buttons dot left button dot pressed. Okay. Yeah, I think I have seen an example of that before. Probably in one of Carl's videos, if I had to guess. The len, yeah, casting nil to the input pointer. Yes. That was another one where Casey just did it this exact way, but it was in C, right? Where was that? I'm in the wrong place. Yeah, that right there. Casey just did it this way to get at the length of the controller's array, right? And I didn't think it would even work, but I did it and then it worked. So I could just as easily say max controllers in here, right? Because it should be the same number as the number of controllers on our game input. But I don't know. I was kind of proud of the fact that it even worked, as strange as it seems, and I just decided to leave it in there. So, yeah.
The more efficient version and see kind of how that plays out, if that makes sense. So off we go. We loop over our entities here, and obviously when we get this, we can sort of see what is the actual residence of a particular entity, right? So here's my entity index, here's its residence, and we can just say, for right now, we're only going to deal with the high entities for the moment, because that's the only thing we actually know how to do. We don't actually have any definitions for low, or what they would be doing out there, but we'll have to sort of figure that out as we go. So here we go, and I guess we have that exists thing, but I feel like now that we have entity residence, exists won't necessarily be something we need, because we could just have non-existent or something, right? We can just have some and we could reorganize this. So basically, you don't exist, you're dormant, you're low, or you're high, right? And we can sort of move that concept of existence sort of up into the actual entity residence instead of having a separate Boolean for it, which isn't really necessary. So assuming that it is in the residence high table, then we can say, okay, well then if it is, we want to get the high entity out of it, and let's go ahead and grab that. So we've got our high entities, so that's in game state, high entities, and we will grab its entity index, there we go, like so. So that'll basically give us what we needed to know for that. And now we're saying that basically the P in...
He's getting way ahead of me because I can't even figure out where we're at here. It's in the middle of drawing the entities. It's like way down at the bottom of the game loop. Yeah, here it is. And so instead of asking whether the entity exists, he's going to, get rid of it. That's what this to-do is about. Well, kind of. Yeah, camera view. Not necessarily specifically Z, but the camera view. So we can go ahead and comment that out and say if well, this is going to be off of the game states, right? So we're going to get at the... Oh, I need the actual entity index out of here now. Okay, and so if it's high, right? Does that work? Or do I need to, I can't remember if I need to prefix it with the dot, or if I can just do this.
In the residence high table, then we can say, okay, well then if it is, we want to get the high entity out of it, and let's go ahead and grab that. So we've got our high entities, so that's in game state, high entities, and we will grab its entity index, there we go.
So maybe pulling this out, right, is just not the way to go, because I mean entities is going away. So we could say 1 to the length of the game state's entity count, right? So that would go away. And this needs to be equal to. My son's trying to break into the room. But what he doesn't know is that I've placed a 55-pound kettlebell in front of the door. So he can't bust in while I'm streaming. Yeah. I think this is how this should look. Or maybe not, actually. Yeah, this is off of the entity count as well. Although, he is starting with the first one. The 0th index. And it's basically going to be, when we create that null entity, it's just going to be none, right? Its entity residence should be none. And so right here, I'm sorry, you're probably hearing my son screech in the background. It's nap time and he doesn't care for it. So then we get the high entity out. I don't know if this is going to work. Yeah, if I try and go to definition, that doesn't work. Is it like this? I feel like I've had to do something like this before. Well, what even is that? STL pressed? Oh, that's just a constant. I heard a follow notification. Apollo in shorts, thank you for the follow. I need to, I guess I didn't turn off my notifications after the last stream. So I need to remember to do that. I know I've had to do this before, but for some reason OLS isn't giving me the assist here. Like, this would be it right here, wouldn't it? Yeah, so that's an enum, and the value that comes out of it is an I32. So it should be a dot. It's throwing me off that it's not. Oh no, okay. Wait a minute. Oh geez. Okay. I don't like that it's not. Yeah, we're gonna have all sorts of problems trying to compile this now. Maybe OLS isn't giving me anything to work with here because so much other stuff is busted up here. Yeah. But I think it's going to look like that with the dot in front of the enum value.
Like so. So that'll basically give us what we needed to know for that. And now we're saying that basically the P in here is exactly what we actually wanted directly, right? I'm out of tea. Man, I brought 2 teacups, and I'm out completely. It's like, how's that even happen, right? Gotta get more tea. All right.
Well,
Jeeves,
you probably drank it, Casey.
fetch the tea. I need those little bells that they have in fancy British documentaries. All right. So if I have a high entity, what I need to do is I need to grab out its information about where it is. And what I'm saying is that now this is already relative to the camera, right? So this is already relative to the camera. Already is.
Poor kid. So I'll just get rid of that and say, like he's saying here, relative to the camera.
So all I have to do is draw it relative to the camera now, which means I go ahead and say, and one interesting thing that's to think about there is if we did want to do a split screen thing, we'd have to do something a little fancier here because it's like, well, which camera, right? So we need to have, at that point, you would need to have some note in the residence. When you said it was resident in high, you had to say which camera it belonged to. There'd be some kind of fussiness there, right? So that'd be a little more complicated. I don't know if we want to deal with that because I don't think the split screen's a very good idea, but something to put in the back of your head. If it comes down to it, we will have to do more work there. So anyway, we'll get the high entity out, and now we just need to say, all right, all we need to do now is just take a look at that high entity P, and that gives us exactly what we actually want. There we go, .x. And I think we also need the dormant entity portion to get the width and the height out, right?
So screen center Y plus and minus. Okay, I see. That's why we don't need this diff anymore. Whoops. There we go. And then this one is going to be the dormant. I typed doormat like he does over and over again. Dormant entities is where our width and height will be stored. And now I'm wrapping. Don't know how I feel about how that looks. I guess that conversion from meters to pixels should be on the same line. That's fine.
Yeah, and so again, don't worry too much about what we're doing here. I'm just playing around with it. Obviously, there's a bunch of things that are kind of a little messy. Like it's like, okay, we have to do 2 different gatherers of memory to get it, which is not necessarily a bad idea because probably there's enough that it would be 2 different cache lines anyway, so it's not really necessarily a big deal. But again, don't think too hard about it yet. I just want to see what we have to do, and then we'll start worrying about massaging this sort of thing to make sure that we're not setting up a performance trap for ourselves later when we have to optimize this stuff. But for now, don't worry too much about that because it's not our primary focus. Our primary focus right now is to see how we would structure this at all at the start. So yeah, so if we were going to fetch all of them, let's say, right, then it would look like this, right? This is how we'd fetch all of them. So let's assume we fetch all of them. It's the dormant entity that has the width, right? And then we've got sort of anything else. Do we have anything else on here? I don't even know what else we've got. Let's see. Right. Okay. So this
Almost don't want to use these very verbose names and just call them like D entity for dormant, H for high, L for low, but we'll just stick with this for now. Any other, let's see, this is going to be off the high, and then that might have been it. And I'm going to get a complaint about instantiating this and doing nothing with it, so we'll just strike that out.
stuff now we actually have to deal with also because when you put things in like the get entity stuff, obviously that has to know who it's fetching, whether it's fetching high entities or low entities or so on. In this case, I feel like what we want is get entity, right? We want to call this is really get high entity is what it always is essentially, right? I'm sensing a funness. I'm sensing a fun thing. Okay. Yeah, I'm liking where this is going. All right, I'm liking this a lot. Are you with me on this? I don't know if you guys are with me on this. Does everyone already know what I'm about to do? I think you already all do, so it's fine. But I kind of got excited about it there. So what I just realized is actually, if I basically say that these are flags, right, like so, then what you could say was just, okay, when I call get entity, it returns me an entity. And when I ask for that entity, I can just say, why don't I tell you, right, what state I wanted the entity in? So like I want, the state of the entity. I can say which state it is, and then when it goes to get it, it can move it into the state that it needs to be in if it wasn't already in that state, right? So when I call get entity, right, all I have to do is say, oh.
Well, there you go. We go ahead and turn this into a U32 tagged enum, right? And then so whatever this residence value is, it just gives us whether we have a low entity, a dormant one, or a high one. I think that's right. Seems straightforward enough. I guess I don't know. Yeah. I won't think about it too much right now, because that's just likely to make me get confused. Just mess with the ordering a bit here. All right. Yeah, it's coming together. We're getting there.
Okay, when you call get entity, you tell me what state you wanted this guy to be in. I don't know that maybe I don't actually need those to be flags, because I guess they're always kind of, yeah, never mind. I didn't actually need them to be flags. That's not true, because they're always strictly in order. So I guess I can still just say, right, something like this, residence.
All right, never mind. He walks that back immediately. Well, yeah, I'm not sure. Let's see where he goes with this.
So like that. Okay. So yes, but still, everything else still applies. I can just say I wanted it at this level of residence, and when this guy goes to get it, if it's not at that level of residence, he can just move it in. So that way, when we do get entity, right? Let's go ahead and do this here. What's going on? There we go. You switched on me. Switch back. There we go. Try it again. Okay. I like it to have it on the right side for some reason, which is bad, I guess. I guess because it's it's closer to my center line of view. It really means I should move this over here and the mini buffer over here, but it's like, yeah, you know, it's all complicated.
So what he's been playing around with here with this is making the residence that the entity is currently the entity currently has, whether it's, you know, doesn't exist, high, low, or dormant, embedding that into the entity itself, but then he walks that back, right? Like, and what we would have done, I think, is this, right? Something like that. Then he immediately walks that back, and I guess I just didn't really grasp at why he was... I didn't grasp why he was walking that back, but then he leaves this in here. So I guess I'll just leave that there. Maybe he'll just rip that out in a second, and it's no big deal. But then in here, we say, what's the residence of the entity? Like so. And I can split this up. And over here, we don't have, well, it's still going to be entities. Is that right? That's kind of the little aha moment he had, where it's still going to be a list of entities, but they're each going to have a pointer to their respective, you know, the respective state that they're in, whether it's high, low, or dormant.
Anyway, so if I'm going to go ahead and do all this, now I have to actually do the porting work to make that happen. So I have an entity. I'm going to return that entity structure. We will then go ahead and give it all of the different portions of that. So entity.residence equals residence. And we will say dormant entity.
Okay, so he is leaving this in. And then instead of it being off of entities, he's still going to have, yeah, and that makes sense. We still have to have all those, I guess, versions, all those different states for each entity at each index in each list, right? So over here, we just say that's going to come off of the dormant entities, yeah, because that's going to be a pointer member. Same thing with the low and the high. And this is not entity, I called this result. And this, So I think this can just be this enum type, right? And I guess instead of going off of the length of that list, it's going to be off of the game state's entity count.
These, right? There we go. Low, high. And there we go.
Odin enum array would come in handy again here. I'm definitely going to have to take a look and think about it. I don't want to get hung up on a detail that I don't understand, and then I spend, 20 minutes figuring out the most appropriate way to do it. Like it's tough. I appreciate that you're here and you can help educate me on Odin stuff, but at the same time, I feel like I'll retain the information better if I just like look at it myself and go, okay, what's the problem that Casey is solving, doing it the way he's doing it, and how can I do this the Odin way? And then one of the things that I've said for as long as I've been doing this stream is I want to do things the Odin way. You know, so if there's a more appropriate Odin way to go about doing things, then I'm gonna do that. Like, for instance, wherever there's something that Casey writes himself that is like a math related function, I just use the appropriate procedure call off of the math package. And so I definitely want to do that. I just want to make sure that I have a real good understanding of what it is I'm doing before I throw that in there, specifically for something like this, because we aren't just making a procedure call, a neat little procedure call that encapsulates the thing that Casey is writing from scratch. Here I have to kind of implement it myself and think about it a little more carefully. Always great to see the seaside. Yeah, I guess wherever I'm not calling Odin core library procedures, I'm doing it as close to the way he's doing it, which winds up just making it more sea-flavored Odin maybe. And I did actually the same exact thing when I did this in Zig. So my Zig project is probably mostly, except in the places where I was forced to not do things the C way because there just was no way to do things the C way in Zig. But like a good example where I kind of agonized about this for a while before making this decision was wherever Casey is using multi-pointers, I'm using slices, right? So like for the pixel buffer and the bitmap, and same thing with the sound output. Where is that? Over here. Like originally, and I'm pretty sure in my Zig project, I just use all whatever their multi-pointer syntax is. But it was hammered into me the more and more I looked at Odin that you want to be using slices where you can. And so it took me a while to kind of like fix what it was that I thought I was doing, and with respect to the benefit that slices give you. It's really simple in retrospect because I can just intuit it now, but originally I was like, slices, man, don't talk to me about slices. I've got pointers, they work fine. Because they do tend to work fine for Casey, usually, but you get the idea. Hey, Nintendo fanboy, welcome to the stream.
We go with that and that. So there we go. And then I have to say that it's got to be less than the entity count, right? Entity count. Do I ever try to get an entity who hasn't actually been inked yet? No, I don't, so we're good. All right, so then we're calling get entity here again, which residence. So players will always be in the high because they're always on screen or important, so that's just a given that they're...
Okay, I see where this is going. And I guess what you may be saying here, right, when you're saying that an Odin enum array would come in handy, is that this member would not be, or I guess this type might not be just a plain enum. Maybe that's what you're getting at. I'm sure after I look at enough examples, I'll be able to kind of arrive at a solution that approximates it, and then maybe, you know, in a follow-up stream, whenever you're able to join again, you can tell me whether my implementation would be the correct way to use the enum array or not. And maybe that is the right way to go forward with that. So yeah, then we get in here, and he just plugs in the high value. And then over here, I hate to work ahead of him and then waste time, especially because I've already been streaming pretty long, coming up on 2 hours, but I think we're almost done with this day. Yeah, we have like 10 minutes left, assuming he doesn't go over the Q&A too much, so I think I've got enough time to sit here and think about this. So all of these members got pulled off of the plain entity, and now they're either on the low, dormant, or high, like the width and height. And so I guess it's just as simple as setting those, right? Because when we call get entity, we're getting the pointer for each at that index, stuffing it into this result. And then we can just change that memory in place there. I think it's that simple. I was looking at it and I was like, okay, what is actually going on here? Oh yeah, this is a V3 now, huh? So that's going to change a little bit. Or is it a V2? It's a V2, right? Yeah, V2. Thought that would be more complicated, but I don't think it is. And then, okay, so this isn't going to be a pointer anymore. So he's not going to be able to, well, maybe he can ask if that entity is not null, or if it is, I should say, because he's using C, but I can't do that. Well, so what is it? The dormant entity stores these abs tile things, right? Because, yeah. So actually, maybe all of this, maybe these are all off the dormant entity as well. I think that's right. Because in my head, I was looking at this, I was like, do I get rid of this, right? And that doesn't seem right. Especially because this offset thing is still off of, well, yeah. Only the tile map position still has that offset member, so that's definitely the right call. Whoops. Oh, and then this is still up high, because now we're saying the entity exists. Okay. So yeah, this camera following entity thing. What would you do? I guess you would just check if the high entity pointer is nil. Maybe not, but I think this is what he's gonna do. We'll see. The Odin overview has a short snippet on it. Yeah, I've definitely gone over the Odin overview once, but obviously some elements to it have taken more than others. I'll just peek at that real quick. I've taken to why can't I bring this up? There we go. Some of it has stuck, and just because I've, like slices, for instance, I spent probably like a week on the stream really hammering home an understanding of slices, or maybe that was before I even started the stream, because I was using them a bunch even in the platform layer, right? I started off with multi-pointers, and then I saw, again, cruising the Odin Discord, when I looked at messages people had written in there about multi-pointers, and like a bunch of people, whenever somebody would bring up multi-pointers, somebody would respond saying, don't do that, use a slice. Unless you're basically forced to because of some C API, right? So enum array, if I just look that up, let's just start with enum. Enumerated array. Oh, okay. Well, that's iterating. Here we go. Enumerated arrays allow the use of an enum to be used as indices to a fixed array. So I suppose the way you might use this would be like we have an entity and we would access the low. Right, if this said entity and this was low, then that might be how we think about this. I'm probably saying that wrong. It takes a while to get slices. Yeah, it was not obvious to me, but then now again in retrospect, it makes so much sense that it's like, wow, why didn't I understand? Why didn't I get that at a glance? But it just goes to show how if an abstraction is really useful, then a really good abstraction is worth its weight in gold, because the amount of effort it takes to internalize that abstraction can be very costly. And then if it's a bad abstraction, right? And maybe slices aren't the right example to use there, but I'm just thinking of all the terribly abstracted things I've had to deal with over the course of my career so far, and how part of the reason why I've been getting more and more into lower level programming is because I find that there is less of that if you want to have, I don't know, because I say that while also acknowledging that, like, you know, the C++ world is rife with terrible abstractions, right? Anyway, if I go back up to my to-do here, where was that? Enum array. So it'd be something like this. Maybe I'll actually just yank this. Whoops. That is not right. I don't even know what that was. That was like a commit hash or something. Oh, we've got tabs in here. So instead of it being an array of integers, right, it would be well, yeah, no. Well, this is, yeah, definitely gonna have to sit with this one and think about the right way to apply that, but whoops. I'll come back in the next stream and have something rudimentary in place, I think, that makes use of this. Because I want to understand, and I've seen plenty of people say how great that language feature is, right? I think Carl is one of them. Maybe I need to go back and watch Carl's video on it, because I'm pretty sure he did a video on this exact thing, and it just didn't take, because it's such a novel concept to my brain. I'm just like, well, what is going on here? But I want to get that, I want to be able to appreciate that value and be able to use it in my own code. It's just, I'll never do that if I don't spend the time and sit with it and learn it, right? So anyway, back to what we're doing here. Let's see if I got this right. We'll see what Casey does here.
always going to be high, and that's fine. So we don't have to set their existence anymore because that's already handled, and now we have this. So we've got low.p, like so, right? And then we've got, oh wait, no, that's dormant, sorry, dormant.p.
Did he get rid of that exists assignment? He did. Did he say why?
Given that they're always going to be high, and that's fine. So we don't have to set their existence anymore because that's already handled, and now we have.
Oh, because it's going to be in the enum, right? Because if it doesn't exist, then it'll just be none, I think. I think that makes sense.
This, so we've got low.p, like so, right? And then we've got, oh wait, no, that's dormant, sorry, dormant.p. Okay, so that's in the dormant set there. Doormat, I like that. So that's in the dormant set, and then there's, this is also in there. Dormant set, there we go. And so now the only question is, when I actually do that sort of initialization, I guess I want to be able to kind of move him up into that. I want to map him into the camera space after I set up that whole situation. This is going to be interesting because you see why this is a little bit complicated. Once we initialize a player, I guess it needs to be wherever the camera was, and then that'll be okay, and it'll only be once he moves. So that's actually totally fine. All right, never mind. I thought there was a little bit of an issue there. So this we're going to have to think about a little bit harder, exactly how we want to do that. I'm just going to blow through some more of these and oh yeah, right, this is a dot. I've messed up my dots and my arrows. No one really knows why C decided that it was a good idea to have both of those.
Keep going back to this enumerated array thing. It's starting to gel in my head, but I don't want to get I don't want to keep getting myself sidetracked on it.
Seems like you always just want dot. I don't know why they did arrow. It was a very odd decision. It doesn't seem sensible. Anyway, get entity. So, okay, in this one, we're also going to see whether or not there actually was an entity that the camera was already following, and I guess we don't care which residence that was, so it could be dormant for all we care. Doesn't actually matter. But we just want to see whether or not it actually existed. So we just want to say if entity dot residence equals non-existent, right? So if it's not.
So he did do that a bit differently. Let's see here. Yeah. I see, and then he checks the residence, not whether, because I guess if the entity exists, then it has a high, a low, and a dormant. I suppose, but the way that Casey is starting to kind of design this, it's just taking a second for me to intuit how it is he's doing this. Because now instead of, just having that one simple list of entities, we've got all this different stuff flying around. And instead of this being a comparison to nil, we're checking if it's none. So if the entity has no residence and therefore does not exist, right? Maybe I should have just made this non-existent like him, but I figured none was fine. And I guess the reason we don't pass in a residence other than dormant is because we're not going to do anything with the entity's high or low aspects to it. Like, I guess the thing that I'm struggling with is, like, what do I refer to these, like, dimensions of the entity as? I guess they are just dimensions, right? But it's weird because there's the entity in the abstract, and then there's, like, the concrete, aspects of it that we're storing in memory that these pointers point to.
Existent, then we want to start following the first player, I guess is what we decided to do. So that's fine. So what we need to do now is we need to map this guy properly into that space. So really, in some sense, that's this. And then after we actually initialize it, we could say map entity or set entity residence or something like this, right? change entity residence might be a good name for it, where I basically just pass that entity, and it will go ahead and change it to something that it isn't already. So it'll map it from that dormant to high, and that will do the mapping to where the camera actually is, right?
All right, then. So over here, we'll call that. And is he going to pass in a pointer to it? He sure is. And we say that whatever residency it's in now, we want it to be active now.
So that seems fine. Let's see. Add entity doesn't really have to do anything other than clear out all of the...
I'll just go ahead and stub out that change entity residence proc. That way it'll be less work for me to catch up with him when he goes to implement that. So we've got the state, which is actually going to be a pointer. And then the entity itself, also a pointer, and the residence. Yeah, it'll be a fun little exercise for me to think about this off stream, about how I would use enumerated arrays to handle this stuff, because it is definitely going to change a good bit of the code. But I think by seeing how it can be done in this other way, it's going to make the actual thing going on here easier to intuit, right? I'm still, I don't know, like I wrote a bunch of code in Zig, right? But even porting Zig code from his C and C++ for the first 100 whatever days, because I was doing it in the C style, that I think there was a lot of intuition that I missed out on, but that I could have built more of by doing things more in the Zig way, because that's the actual. It's seeing things, the same thing done in two different ways. The example that I keep coming back to my head, I don't even think I've ever vocalized it on streams. Like, programming to me is kind of like playing an instrument, and I've always learned playing. Like, I play guitar, so I've always kind of crossed a threshold with my learning by watching a more experienced guitar player play guitar, because they'll do things that I wouldn't have even thought to do, right, with the instrument, and I'll then take that and try to apply it in my own way. And then you see somebody do something similar but in a slightly different way on guitar, and now you just have more appreciation for both, I guess, and the nuance of what is actually going on. I don't know. I'm doing a bad job of articulating this, but I like seeing how different, how you can skin, how many different ways you can skin a cat, I guess, is the way to put it when it comes to programming problems. So anyway, I think that's that. Cannot determine type for, what do you mean? Did I not declare this right? What is this error saying? Implicit selector expression high. I mean, didn't we do this with get entity? What did I do differently here? That's weird. Whatever. I won't worry about that right now. Pretty weird stuff. Wonder if that will stick around. Yeah, I know for a fact it doesn't stick around in the same shape that it's in right now. He definitely walks back a good amount of it, and whatever solution he winds up with later on looks a good deal simpler to me from what I can remember, but that was a while back. I'd only use enumerates if the amount of keys, high, dormant, etc. gets high, or you want to access the values by the key. Give me dormant, etc. by the amount. Yeah. Well, that's good to know. Yeah, I just don't... Why is it giving me this error here? Like, I don't know. Well, we'll cross that bridge once we get through some of these other errors. It just doesn't... I hate when I see something and I can't make sense of why I'm seeing it when I have every reason to believe that it should be fine. You know what I mean? Like earlier, I was working on fixing a query for some work I've been doing, and I was like, the query is right. The query is right. It does exactly, it didn't do exactly the thing that I thought it should be doing. And, you know, then I get humbled all over again because I wrote that query a long time ago and I had every reason to believe it was working, and this whole time it sucked. Looks fine to you too. Okay. Glad I'm not the only one.
State, right? That was really all we said that add entity even did, was add entity just clears everybody. So really we could just say, okay, if you're going to add an entity, you can basically add the entity as a dormant entity. So that's just going to be dormant entities, entity index equals nothing, low entities, and high entities, right? Equals nothing, like so.
Okay, so I guess, did he move that assertion around? Maybe he did, and I wasn't paying attention. But it has to change anyways because this isn't even a member on our state anymore. Over here, we're going to just zero out. Well, they should already be zeroed, right? Maybe I should let him finish. I should really let him finish before I start getting all these ideas in my head about what's going on here. Yeah, I think I had the same exact conversation with myself before because I dereferenced that entity and zeroed it out here, but I didn't think that should be necessary because Odin will do that for me anyways. Maybe he was just doing it explicitly for posterity.
And then we basically just set that table, our residence table,
because
residence, that's going to be equal to...
I had a thought and it didn't even come out of my mouth because he zero initializes everything when he allocates the big chunk of memory right up front in the platform layer. So in my head, he shouldn't need to, you know, zero it out either, but maybe I'm missing something.
Oops, let's see here. That's going to be equal to dormant. I guess that's how everything gets added probably, right? And you're done. So that seems reasonable. That totally seems fine so far. I don't know that we care about any of the rest of this. Let's see, change, yes, we haven't written that yet, and that's fine. We want to assert that totally seems... That seems reasonable. That totally seems fine so far. I don't know that we care about any of the rest of this. Let's see, change, yes, we haven't written that yet, and that's fine. We want to assert that basically we are not out of the array range of any of these. Let's move that up so it's not underneath my head. Change entity residence, DP. Okay, so this will basically just do, yeah, it's still going to do...
Still lots to work through here. I actually don't know if he's going to finish this during this stream, but we'll see. Something like that.
What we had before with this could probably range of any of these. Let's move that up so it's not underneath my head. Change entity residue.
Okay. I thought it was weird. I could have sworn I saw him copy this assert so that there was 4 of them. It's just these 3 that we care about.
DP. Okay, so this will basically just do, yeah, it's still going to do what we had before. With this could probably pass by value, maybe. It's quite a few pointers. I don't know how we want to do that, but probably we'd do something like this, right? So we'd say that entity high. So everywhere we did entity arrow would now be like probably entity dot high arrow, like so, and so on.
Okay, yeah, so there's going to be a lot of places here where, and specifically because we're working on the movement code, makes sense that this is all going to be off of the high entity. What's going on with this here? Oh, because you want a tile map position. Yeah, so that's not going to be... quite right. Well, this should probably be off. Oh, whoops, no, that's fine. This should be off of dormant, right? And did he actually make that off the dormant?
Like so.
He did not, because he was just kind of shotgunning it. Okay. I think he'll have to do something about that here soon, and then maybe the same thing with all of these, because that abs tile X business is all off of the tile map position, which I can't remember if that's going to go away or not, but yeah, that's right. Whoops, I put that in the wrong order. You can tell I really need a break. My brain is just starting to break here. Okay, that looks good. And this will actually be off the high entity. So many errors, so little time. What is this warning about? Oh, what? How'd that happen? Okay, we'll see just how much of this is actually going to be, actually break this off like this. We'll see how much of any of this is going to stick around, because I think Casey's going to have to make some more changes. But, and actually this is off of dormant again. Because we still got all this camera relative business to sort out, I think.
None of this, yeah, none of this is actually really necessary anymore, right? Because, well, first of all, this stuff can just go away. We don't need any of that anymore.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even... My brain! Why didn't I... So all of this is nuked, right? Because we have our new movement code. I should have spotted that sooner. And I can't remember... Yeah, so... This is just now cemented in. As the new movement code. Whoops.
Because we're not doing things that way anymore. And now we also really don't have to do this stuff anymore either. Yeah, this is going to be an interesting change. This is going to take a while because we can get rid of a lot of cruft here. This will probably have to be a loop through to tomorrow kind of a change, because there's easily another whole hour's worth of work in here with all the stuff we can change. The collision detector doesn't have to actually do any of this stuff with the tiles anymore either, because that stuff will get mapped in to the working set basically.
Okay, well, I think it's good on some level that I'm hitting myself over the head with this, because the consequence of splitting these things out is, like he's saying, like some of these values we get out without having to do a bunch of extra calls, is basically what I think I just heard. Don't think you got to do the asserts since Odin handles that already. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I think I just had those in for posterity, but now that you mention it, yeah. If we access this out of bounds, right, it'll just bark at us and we'll know. We still have this error, which I can't make sense of, but that's okay. So yeah, all this work is definitely going to bleed into tomorrow, which is kind of what I thought was going to happen. And I'd rather him do that than just kind of, you know, zoom through it, because this is like one of the bigger changes that has happened on stream up to this point.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this stuff entirely for the moment. So that will just basically be old player P, high P. There we go. We don't need that at all.
Now that you mention it, I probably have some other asserts like that. Or maybe I don't. Maybe I got rid of them all. I think I got rid of them everywhere else, because I think Casey had a similar thing going on here. And it was asserting correctly. Well, it would tell me if it was out of bounds, if I was accessing memory in the frame buffer that was out of bounds, and that let me know that whatever I was passing in, basically what would happen is whenever I would walk the guy, and it's not going to work right now, but if I stash this really quick, whenever I would walk the guy off of the screen, whether it was, oh, and of course, how did this happen? Apparently I committed that code where the bottom wall was pulled out. No. Something weird just happened there where I didn't actually recompile. But let's say I like walked off screen, right, and then navigated the player so his position would be far enough off the buffer to where I was basically trying to draw out of bounds. The assert was nice for letting me know. Well, it wasn't an assert. Or maybe I did have it as an assert, but like I said, I got rid of it. But whether the assert caught it or the bounds checking on the slice caught it, I didn't want that to happen anymore, right? So that's when I added these checks, so that if the offset into the buffer that I'm indexing at would be out of bounds, right? So either we'd get a runtime error here or here if either of those offsets was out of bounds. I just wanted it to handle the state update on the player, but not crash, you know? So it would basically go and fall into this loop and then try and draw, but nothing would happen because the offset would be set to, or maybe it would iterate, and in that case, maybe you'd want to have something here to skip over that. Because if we're not going to draw anything, right, then, well, let me think about this for a second. I feel like I've already thought through this, but I guess it doesn't hurt to sanity check. Okay, so I think, yeah, so it actually wouldn't fall into this loop and then just, you know, iterate pointlessly, because these max values would get clamped anyways. And because our min would be greater than the max, it would drop into this loop and say, hey, you know, min y is already greater than max y, or at least that variable we get out of there. Anyway, sorry for that tangent. I just wanted to make sure that I actually did that right and didn't screw it up. And that's always a bad feeling when you look at code that you wrote a while back and you go, oh, wait a minute, did I do this right? I don't understand how I did this or whether it's correct. So what's going on here? I guess I didn't catch this at the top of this. What? Oh. Oh. Duh, I stashed all my work. Let's get that back. Okay, we're good.
This will just literally be the entity high P is the old player P, and then the DP, yes, and blah 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 blah. Yes, everything is. So I'm just eliminating the tile map position stuff basically. And so the new player P, all that's going to be is the old player P plus the player delta. Oh, and we're down to the Q&A. No.
Yeah, so there you go. So this actually, all this stuff I was doing to plug in dormant was wrong, because it is just going to go off of the high entity position. But this offset stuff, like there's multiple things going on here with the camera and, you know, where the player's position is relative to the camera. And then I think this makes it not as simple to just do smooth scrolling versus like per screen movement where the player can move freely around, but the camera doesn't change.
Oh man, I was just getting started too. Well, you know how it is. You know how it is. Well,
what's he doing with this?
Oh man, I was just getting started too.
So he's gonna cut it off over here. I see. Yeah, I think he just said that he can get rid of that offset altogether. But where did... Okay, so he actually just calculates it instead of making that proc call.
Well, you know how it is. You know how it is. Sometimes you run out of time. You run out of time when you're trying to program. So let's go ahead and sort of clean things up just a little bit.
All right, so it looks like he's going to wrap this up. But all of this is going to get... Well, I'm probably just going to have to comment this out because there's probably a bunch more errors. Maybe I could just fix those errors and we'll still kind of if zero it out. Is that right? Yeah. So I'll just try and zoom through. This has been kind of a tedious move. Code around and try and get that old code to use this new understanding of entities, how we're treating entities. But I think we'll get some good results in tomorrow's stream for all this work. Oh, this is, whoops. Yeah, it is tempting to just comment all this out because this is probably all going to be treated a good deal differently, but It's okay. And this, I'm just going to comment this out because, well, is that right? Or does it want this? What's the dormant? Comment this out and just say, yeah, we'll just do it like that for now. Where did my ab style X and Y go? It says they're undeclared, but they're declared right here as far as I can tell. Oh, jeez. Well, this is all... Yeah. Dang it, I think I'm just going to have to comment on all this code. Because this doesn't have... The old player P is, you know, this high... entities position. And so this ab style X and Y stuff isn't going to come off of that anymore. So... whatever. All right, let's see what else we got here. Ah, yeah, same thing. Well, we can say, what do we do if the residence is not none? What? Oh, that has to go off of... Oh, wait. How did that happen? I was not paying attention at all when I did that. Okay. And then this... I think this might be a similar thing where he can just assign... Well, no, because we still need to know... Well, maybe not. Maybe he won't need to do any of this if the high entity position is just relative to the camera anyways.
So we've got change entity residence here, right? Which is going to take that game state, and it's going to take an entity to change, entity. And I guess really that's just going to take an entity index, because that one's, well, yeah, we'll take an entity. So that'll take an entity there. Yeah, so change entity residence, that'll go ahead and do that. And now I just need to see which entity residence, which one it actually wants to implement this. There we go. And clean up some of these last little things here. I would like to get it compiling before we stop, if possible, because that's usually nice. So this has to be a high entity, obviously. Basically, the only thing we were working with before were entities that would have been high. We didn't have any dormant entities at all.
Go down into here and pass that, right? Or I think the residence was the second argument, yeah. Like that.
Right. What's this asking about? Cannot convert. Oh, right. Put that in the right place. Glad. See, again, type checking is so good. Catches so many errors. And that will be like that. If the residence equals not consistent, there we go. Then I think that's all correct. All looks good. Camera following entity gets gotten this way, and I guess we don't really care about which one it is, but it should be high. I guess we do care because it should always be high if the camera's following it.
Pass in that residence param here too.
So if residence equals non-existent, so I probably want to make an actual check for that. I feel like there should just be an if exists, basically.
I don't know why I was flipping those conditionals. Do you see what I did? Well, yeah, no, actually I didn't. That was right.
Thing that's coming up pretty often. Let's see, does not have an overloaded member operator. That's true, it doesn't. So that's just a high P. And the abs tile Z, oh, right, so that's actually dormant P. And this is also a dormant P, but let's see. So really, this, you know what, I'm gonna if this 0 out as well, because this can all be done differently too, because now this will all be in the right space to do, fix this to work in camera space. We won't have to work with tiles there either. Yeah, this is gonna be a nice change. I think this is what have been wanting to do, but like I said, you kind of got to go in waves so that you know that you're not doing things totally dumbly.
Dumbly.
In waves. I think this is what we won't have to work with.
So yeah, this is kind of what I was talking about a minute ago. All of this is going to have to be a little bit different now. Just because of this big change that we're making. All that work. We had such a nice non-game that was running and it did all the things that it needed to do, and all this is just making us have to move in this whole other direction.
Tiles there either. Yeah, this is going to be a nice change. I think this is what have been wanting to do, but like I said, you kind of got to go in waves so that you know that you're not doing things totally dumbly. Let's see here. So entity residence, that's this. Dormant entity, let's see here. Dormant entity width and height. Dormant entity is not, oh, because I spelled it wrong? Doormat entity. Well, if we ever have a doormat entity, that would be an appropriate name for it, right? We could have a doormat, something that the player steps on when they go, you know, to a house or something like that. Okay, and let's see. So that's going to be high entity facing direction. Okay, so that's not going to, now we've totally regressed. Our game is totally busted at this point. So, you know, what can we do? That's just the way it goes, but at least we're running, and that's fine.
Okay, so that's all I need to do. Fix the rest of these errors, and we'll be up to speed for tomorrow. Still don't understand why that is failing. Undeclared name, change entity residence. So I just didn't name it correctly. Ah, spelled entity wrong. That figures. So that's fixed, and then we just have some stuff that we have to stamp out briefly. And we're good to go. And we'll see if this actually works. And it does. So we're caught up with Casey. Kind of made that more painful for myself than I should have, but the more I do that, the more valuable I realize it is, because once I start trying to make these changes based off what I think is going on, right, versus what is actually going on, the moment of clarity hits a bit harder. And so I want to lean into that, I think, as often as I can and make the mistakes, because, you know, that's like the trope, or what the adage is, right? Like, success is predicated on many failures. And if I'm just rotely copying him every time, which is mostly what I did writing this all out in Zig, however tedious it may be to just, like, you know, start updating things and then, you know, watch him do it, and then turns out he wasn't going in that direction at all. Seeing that difference actually helps, I think, even though it might be more tedious that way. So yeah, we'll see. I think he's probably just gonna jump into the Q&A, which I don't have time for, but we'll see if he has any parting words, parting wisdom for us.
So tomorrow we will go through and finish this entire sweep. And I think our code will be in a much better place there. It'll be really much simpler to work with now that we've finally done the change that sort of I've been saying we should do for a while, but never quite got around to doing. So let's go ahead and start the Q&A, since we're a little bit over time. Not too much, though, only about 3 minutes, so that's good. So please, if you could, prefix your colons with your colons. Prefix your questions, or your colons. Prefix your questions with Q colon. So I can see them, and if you could, keep it to things that we've done on today's stream or on previous streams. If you have questions that are off topic, save those for pre-stream, which just come 50.
All right, so yeah. solid day. I know it took me a little bit longer, but we kind of went off on some different tangents that I think were worth going on, especially during that first half of the stream, where we just kind of talked about, the entity storage and how that can impact the game design, even if my assumptions are wrong, about how those things are linked. It'll be fun to go and prove them wrong, most likely, or prove them right. And also just have more food for thought about what kind of game we want to actually make, how we build things will impact that down the line. So, yeah, and then I have this note, this to-do here for looking at enumerays, and Skytrius over here, who I'm not sure exactly. I think Skytrius might be like the editor of Odin, the Odin website's newsletter, or among other things, right? But also a contributor, a core contributor. So thank you for sitting in and chiming in with me on this stream. But I'll be sure to look at enumerays. I saw this comment that you had over here about, and I think I read it earlier, about using enumerays, but only if the number of keys gets really high, or we want to access the values by the key. So maybe, I don't wind up using that here because Casey is gonna walk it back. We never get to more than these three here, these three different kinds of entities, and I'm pretty sure we just get rid of low entity at some point, and then an entity is either active or dormant. But I think it'll still be a good learning exercise for me to see about how using that would go. I'll probably dive into the Odin code base and look at some other examples of how that's being used, and then I'll come up with something, and then we'll talk about it a bit on stream tomorrow, and I'll see where that leaves me, whether I want to stick to using it or if we'll just kind of leave it as a thought exercise and then move on with the same implementation Casey has. But obviously, if I leave it in using this other approach, and that's the other thing that I struggle with on stream sometimes, is doing things in the Odin way versus the C way. If I do things too differently from him, and then he goes and makes a bunch of changes, it might make it that much harder down the line, because now, the paths have diverged enough to where it makes it that much harder for me to, because you can see, like, we're not really doing anything differently from him, and it was kind of tough for me to keep up and slam in those changes, and we're still not done. So tomorrow could be pretty painful getting that to just back to working the way it was before, but having in, baking in these concepts now of different like entity states based on their locality to the the player. But anyway, thanks for hanging out with me, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good night.